A study commissioned by Inyathelo, the South African Institute for Advancement, has revealed a significant increase in philanthropic funding for South African universities. However, the study also indicates disparities in funding distribution that continue to plague the higher education sector. For more on this, we're joined by Feryal Domingo, Executive Director of Inyathelo. Feryal, appreciate your time this evening. Now, in this report that we've just read, a significant increase in philanthropic income for South African universities in 2020 reaching 2.31 billion, nearly double the funding in 2019. Let's talk about what's resulted in this massive increase in philanthropic funding.
Yeah, hi Hugo, thank you very much. Well, the study was focused also on the impact of COVID, the 2020 research study particularly, and what we have found is that the impact is mainly attributed to an increase in donors. So some 11,244 donors contributed to 10 of the institutions who participated in this research in 2020. This is the 2020 statistics of universities that we've compiled in this research report, compared to about 4,355 donors in 2013. So we're using the baseline of 2013. So you'll see there's a significant increase in the number of donors. But also another key finding in this study, in this research, is that there's been a shift in allocation. And so unlike previous years where students were actually received the bulk of the funding of philanthropic support, the pandemic actually caused a significant shift. Some, like 40% of funds, were directed to infrastructure, and we're talking about vaccination stations, and sort of less than 30% went to student funding, which is quite a shift. And of course, we understand there was a need for the infrastructure. Another key finding that we want to mention is that there is obviously the 10 participating universities employed at the end of 2020. The statistic is that they employed about 178 full-time and part-time staff in the fundraising, development, and alumni office, and this was just below 2019 and 2018 figures, but there was an increase from the total of 138 staff in 2013. So you'll see there's been a significant jump, and what we know is that the numbers suggest that the more an institution appoints people to do the fundraising, the bigger the team of people, obviously the bigger the income that university will attract. So we've seen that philanthropic income increase as a result of more people doing the work in those offices and raising the level of funding that's needed. So there's that is quite a significant finding. And then the other significant finding is that there's been a shift in the CETA strategy. So before we've seen more non-traditional universities who generally attract CETA funding. What we see now is that more traditional universities actually attracted a larger sum of significant CETA funding. And so that sort of left the non-traditional institution with a little bit less income in terms of CETA funding for this particular year of research. So those were some of the key findings, Hugo.
So, Feryal, let's talk about which universities, if you were to grade them. I mean, what are your top three or top five universities in terms of receiving funding? If I took a guess and I said, is Stellenbosch amongst those, University of Cape Town, etc., would I be right?
Well, I'm not going to suggest that they received more funding, what I'm going to say, because, each of these 10 universities who participate, they each get their own individual confidential reports. And so the report then actually aggregates the total income, right? And so it's difficult for me to put out this publicly, but the 10, I can tell you who the participating universities were so that you can see more or less. So it was the Durban University of Technology, the Tshwane University of Technology, the University of Cape Town certainly was there, the University of Free State, and then the University of Johannesburg, University of KwaZulu-Natal, the University of Pretoria, and then the University of Stellenbosch, the University of the Western Cape, and the University of the Witwatersrand. So those 10 were the participating universities in this particular research.
So are you able to tell us the impact of historical, political or structural factors in contributing to the funding or the funding distribution?
So say that again, I'm sorry.
I said, are you able to walk us through the historical or political implications of funding to the distribution that you might have picked up in this research that you did?
Yeah, it's sort of hard, you know. I mean, politics on education is big, right? We do understand that. And then, of course, the other issue is student fees. Recently, we know the issue of fees must fall. Those were all fundamental issues in the research that we've picked up over time. Unfortunately, the research didn't particularly focus on the impact of that, and so I unfortunately can't talk to that. It didn't come out. It wasn't a focus for the research.
But something that did come out was a comparison between international and local donors in their philanthropic giving to universities. What were you able to establish?
What we found is that, yes, there's been a surge in local giving for universities. The number that I mentioned earlier on, a large portion of that represents South African giving. We have seen a decline slightly in international giving, but at the same time, international giving has continued reasonably well for some universities, and a lot of the South African giving has increased because I think of COVID and the need to also, you know, there was in 2020, I think, the shift towards students who required infrastructure, tech, all of that. And we did see quite a big a shift in giving by South Africans.
Feryal, did you at all examine the various pitches that the universities put across when looking for funding? And obviously, if it's a determinant in their ability to receive that funding, because I'd imagine those that better package and better sell themselves are more likely to receive funding. And also, I suppose what would also come into context is, what are you fundraising for?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's so universities, the traditional universities, as you know, is very research based, and so would automatically, I think it's okay to say that they do tend to attract more funding. It also depends on what industry research is being done. And so traditional universities do attract more philanthropic giving. And some of the non-traditional universities are sort of coming to the party. I think that they are getting funding. They are definitely attracting funding, but it is still the traditional universities that is attracting the lion's share.
Okay, I'd like us to have a conversation around what it is that the international donors are contributing to, but we're going to have that conversation when we come back, speaking to Feryal Domingo, Executive Director of Inyathelo. We return to our conversation with Feryal Domingo, Executive Director of Inyathelo, as we take a look at the funding for universities as stock equality emerges, and that's been clear in that research done by Feryal. Feryal, thanks for staying with us. Just before the break, we talked about the parity in giving between international and South African donors. What are the international donors giving to when they consider South African universities?
Are you saying what are they giving to?
Yes,
So
that is
you
correct.
go,
That is correct. To what causes are they giving to when those pitches are coming through from local universities?
well, I mean, it's in the fundraising space, in the advancement, as we term it, in Inyathelo space, it's not so much what they give it to, because you have to find a match between your need as an institution and the funder's need. So there has to be a match. So as I was saying, this particular research, there was quite a big, significant amount of money given. And you mentioned the number earlier on when we started. You spoke about 2.66 billion. And so it's a huge amount of money. A lot of that money was given to, as I mentioned earlier, infrastructure, setting up stations, vaccination stations, research. You can well imagine during 2020, which is what this research is focused on, there was a big drive for research into the pandemic. And so research universities, who are traditional research institutions, were attracting funding for the type of research that was required during COVID in 2020. So for this particular research, Hugo, I just want to reiterate, a significant amount of that funding came for research around the COVID pandemic. As well as obviously some of the other things. There was still money invested in student scholarships and that sort of thing. But the biggest amount, I think, the biggest focus was on how much the pandemic required and attracted funding for that kind of research.
So I'm going to ask you to maybe look at your crystal ball, for want of a better description, because this research takes us back to 2020, and it's been 3 years on where there is no COVID, or at least not for the last couple of years. Do you foresee a shift in where funding will go from those areas around infrastructure that we spoke about to other areas, for instance, such as student education?
You know, fortunately, I'm not a magician, and I'm not a wizard, and I wish I had a crystal ball, Hugo. And so it's very hard to say, because, we see the shifts and the changes all the time. And if I was an expert in the field raising money at universities, I'd probably be in a better position to answer you. Currently, we are planning the 2021 research, which we're starting in the new year. What we have found from working, just the other day we had a conversation with a group of people from Guildford College in the States, and they're coming to do some research with us, and they are going to focus on entrepreneurial income done at universities. So there's another component of, philanthropic income, and also entrepreneurial income. What did universities raise? How are they better able to reduce that gap in terms of raising the level of income that they need without depending on philanthropic income in the way that we do, or rather third stream income? Now remember, universities have three types of income. One is government funding, and then the second one is student fees, and only the third one is third stream income. So this is where, everybody's going gaga and trying to find every bit of dollar, rand out there from either individual givers or from corporates or industry who wants to conduct research, etc. So there are three streams of income coming in, and I don't know we can say too much about any increase in government funding. I think the student fees, as we've seen, is, there's more need to find scholarships to cover the student fees. There are huge unpaid fees at universities. And so there is a lot of work being done by universities, tertiary higher education institutions, to raise enough funding to cover all of that. And then, of course, as I said, then there's the third stream income. So I don't think I quite answered your question, but I also painted a picture of the complexity of that universities are experiencing, and so they sort of break it up into three categories of funding that they need to raise in order to remain relevant and to remain a going concern rather than profitable.
Now, Feryal, when we look at the considerations by these philanthropic individuals or institutions to give to South African universities, do they look at issues around corporate governance? So, and I ask because there have been a number of strikes in the universities in the early part of this year and obviously previously. Would this play a factor in whether a philanthropic university or establishment gives to a particular establishment or not?
So I think there's definitely something to say about poor governance will definitely not attract funding. Inyathelo also does work in the area of governance and across the board, so not just with universities, but also with the non-profit sector. And one of the big things that we advocate is that you've got to get your house in order, and starting with governance. So good governance is everything, right? And clearly, if there is no governance, who wants to invest in an organization, an entity, or even a higher education institution where there is a lack of good governance? So that is a very, very key issue. At the moment, it's been for a little while. We've seen an uptick in interest and demand for Inyathelo to come and present offerings and interventions around governance training. But I would imagine at universities, who is in focus, I mean, they can't hide, right? It's a big issue. Yeah, it's definitely impacts on it. I mean, it could be a risk for them in attracting funding, for sure.
Now, based on your research, I'd like to imagine that you're quite familiar with what it is that the philanthropic institutions look for when they're giving any form of support to university establishments. So what would you advise a university, if a university were to come to you and say to you, we would like to raise the numbers or raise a profile of this establishment? What do you think are some of those key factors that they would have to look at?
Well, it's interesting. We advocate that the 10 elements of advancement, which is a phrase that we have coined at Inyathelo. It's really an American concept, but we talk about the 10 elements of advancement, and it goes from strategy to cultivation, relationship building, good governance, strategy, having all of those things in place so that you can be attractive for support. And so there's 10 elements. And if you do not have these 10 elements in place, then I'm afraid you're not quite going to be as attractive for support as you'd like to be. And we're talking about voice and visibility, communication, human capacity, having the right people in the positions as well. And so it's a whole concept, the 10 elements of advancement. We actually do conduct capacity building with university alumni officers. We've done a couple. We've done quite a bit of this work over the last 20 years of our existence, but that is the fundamental 10 elements to have in place so that you can be attractive for support. And governance is coming out. In the last few years, we've seen it pop up in a very, very big way. It is something, it's interesting that, sometimes organizations and universities seems to just exist and continue, and they don't quite pay as much attention to the governance and having all the things in place to make sure that they have the right policies, in place to be able to conduct their work and soundly.
And are the alumni of most universities major contributors, or are they a factor in contributions?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't know which university you went to, and I hope you are one of the alumni who gives to your university. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the big focuses of the development or the advancement office. They do, you would have probably received your annual letters from your university as well. So it's one of the big areas of income or buckets of income that they focus on. So yeah, so not every university of all the 26, I don't think they all have these programs in place, but certainly the ones as part of the research have good alumni programs in place.
So let's talk a little bit about collaborations that might exist as part of these acts of philanthropy. Do we find that there are any situations where, for instance, a university has a strong medical research unit or school, and that there are, for instance, multinational companies that are in the space of medicine that are likely to support those as philanthropic activities, or would the bigger corporates in energy, for instance, want to part with several millions worth because a particular university is focused on energy exploration and similar activities?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier on, we talk about the fundraising cycle, and it starts off with your first part of the cycle being that you start to do prospect research, and then you identify whether there's a match, and then you start to cultivate. So it's a long process. We don't necessarily advocate that you just go and write a proposal, for instance, but you cultivate the relationship. And with the alumni, just to give that example, there's a relationship. I have been to a university. I have been impacted on by the university. So there's already a relationship. Now it's a case of just getting that alumni to give, and what is your strategy to convince them to give. And it's similarly when you're looking for a partner, collaborator, donor, giver, grant maker. You have to take the time to nurture and cultivate before it happens, right? So to explain the process it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It's a journey. You're dating, and then you kind of finding a way to find the common space, and then you actually sit down and, so it is, I mean, fundraising is an art. And you'll see that when I mentioned earlier on that the advancement officers in this research, 178, you look at the total number that was raised, you can literally say 178 alumni or advancement staff to the tune of 178 raised X billion. So that's how universities certainly look at it when they like this research, because it enables them to compare how they're doing. So it's almost like, testing their performance. And then they can see how they've done compared to the year before and the year before and so on. And then it helps them to plan for the following year.
Fantastic.
Did it make an
Feryal, I'm afraid we're going to have to call time on the conversation, but appreciate you coming on to News at Prime.